All right, everyone. So we're almost done with the curriculum. Let's go through the 1980s and 1990s. So first thing we got to know about 1980s is it begins with the election of Ronald Reagan, who beat out 1970s President Jimmy Carter for a re-election. Jimmy Carter's running for his second term. Reagan's running for a first. And ultimately, the crowd chose Reagan. Reagan would go on to serve 2 terms in office and would become the leading voice of modern American conservatism. He would become the leading voice of the right wing of America. It's during this time that after the Republicans made a lot of overtures to Southern folk in the 1970s with opposing the busing programs and whatnot, it's under Reagan that this new conservative lead really becomes, where Southern conservatives shift away from the Democratic Party that they had favored since the Civil War and began to become Republicans. Now, before this, Reagan had served as governor of the state of California. And before going into politics, he had been an actor, a Hollywood actor. So one of Reagan's major ideas is something we call supply side economics. And what this is this is a way of viewing the world economically. You see, one of the big problems in the election of 1980 was what's called stagflation. The fact that the economy had grown stagnant. The American economy was not growing. If anything, it was beginning to shrink. And there was massive levels of inflation. Everything was costing more. People weren't earning enough to make ends meet. This is where the trouble started. So Reagan was a big believer in the Laffer curve. And with that, he came up with, he was a big believer in this idea that comes from the Laffer curve, and it's known as supply side economics, also known as Reaganomics, or as George H.W. Bush called it when he was campaigning against Reagan in the primaries, voodoo economics. Here's the idea behind it. What they basically argue is that as tax rates increase, what happens is you reach a certain point, around a 50% tax rate, where the business is earning the maximum it can because the government's taking half. After that point, even though your revenue is theoretically more and more, the government is taking so much of it in taxes that you're actually making less. If you notice the graph, point A and point B are earning the same revenue, right? One being taxed at maybe a 25% tax rate, and the other maybe a 75% tax rate. So then the question becomes, well, why bother building up my business? Why bother earning more if all that's going to happen is I'm going to get stuck with the same amount of money I'd had if my business was much smaller and was getting taxed a lot less? And so the idea became that progressive tax rates deter success. Progressive tax rates are a style of tax rate in which the percentage of your income that you pay, not the amount, because in most tax systems, except for a regressive tax system, the tax amount goes up. In this case, the percentage, what percentage of your income goes to the government, increases the more you make. He argued that, look, these deter success. They make people not want to be successful because after a certain point, you're essentially just working for the government. Most of the money you make isn't going into your pocket anymore. It's going into the government's pocket. So why would I want to be working just for the government to get more money? So Reagan knew he had to deal with an economy that was suffering from stagflation, no growth, and increasingly inflated, devalued currency. To fix this, Reagan proposed a model of deregulation, removing many of the restrictions on banking and finance that were put in place during the Depression. He also worked to break down the power of labor unions and cut back on social welfare programs, welfare, food stamps, stuff like that. In this 1980 campaign ad, he explains what he's going to do, and I'm going to let you see that.
Till we can get inflation under control, we're not going to get all of the other things that ail our economy under control. We do not have inflation because, as President Carter says, we have lived too well. We have inflation in great measure because the federal government has lived too well. And by that, I mean it has become bloated, incredibly inefficient, and has year after year been spending more money than it takes in. And spending more money than you have leads to inflation. A one-shot, piecemeal approach to the inflation problem simply won't work. It's been tried and it's failed. Only an all-encompassing program combining restraint in government spending with economic growth in the private sector will work. I offer precisely that kind of program. To look at the situation we find ourselves in today is to know that we not only need such a program, but that we need such a program now.
The time is now for Reagan.
Now, we got to ask. Now, Reagan was one of the most popular political leaders of the 1980s. And people ask, why was he so popular? And there's a lot of answers to that. One is that he was charismatic. He kind of, you heard him talk, he kind of has that grandpa type of energy, right? And so he could talk in a very simple way that made a lot of people feel like, okay, I can kind of believe that. I can see what he's talking about. That makes sense. And he often appealed to things that were very much made broad appeal, like rugged individualism, right? That you are the master of your own destiny. You are the one who gets to determine how you want to live your life. He often alluded to American greatness, appealing to things like the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, the astronauts landing on the moon. Even his campaign slogan, "Let's make America great again." That was his slogan, yes. Donald Trump literally just cut out the "let's." As one comedian joked famously, all he did was he copied it and made it less polite. But "Let's make America great again" became Reagan's slogan. And it kind of reflected this idea that a lot of people felt at the end of the 70s. The 70s have been kind of a jarring period for America. You know, we'd had a presidential scandal, a lost war, inflation, and that was coming off the 60s where we had presidential assassinations and the civil rights movement. A lot of people were like, this nation feels like it's got all these problems. I want to make it feel like it's better again. Now, again, obviously, there were problems with that. The 50s wasn't actually a utopia. It's just for many people, they were not aware of the problems in society. Now, conservative politicians were gaining strength all over the world as this delicate balance of labor and government and business that had been kind of keeping the economy stable since the end of World War II began to cause stagflation, right? Before this, there was kind of this unspoken agreement between government and big business and labor. The government would facilitate certain conditions that were advantageous to these large companies. These companies often produce their products on a very, pre-planned, like 10-year contract type of thing. The unions got a good cut of that. Everyone was happy. But as stagflation resulted, a lot of people saw this Keynesian economic, this heavy hand of government in the economy as a failure. And quite honestly, the Reagan reforms for many people did bring renewed prosperity. There are people that their place in the socioeconomic world, they went up during the Reagan years and the Reagan economy. The other thing we got to understand is one of Reagan's most popular talking points. Government can't solve the problem. Government is the problem. This anti-government talking point was really popular with a large chunk of Americans. Why? Because it kind of encompassed a little bit of everyone. On one end, you had former hippies, right? If you had grown up as a hippie in the 1970s, you know, fight the power, man. Right? This guy says government can't solve the problem. Government is the problem. Your reaction is going to be, that's what I've been saying the whole time. The government is the problem, man. So instantly you're like, yeah, this guy's talking sense. If you're someone who opposed government welfare, you didn't like the fact the government was taking tax money and spending it on poor people, then you're like, yeah, see, government can't fix that problem. They got to fix that themselves. The government is the problem. They're spending all this money. If you were someone who was tired of the busing program, right, you were tired of your kids being bused to what was previously an all-black school and children of color being bused to what the school you had wanted your kids to go to, you're also going to be like, yeah, see, keep that government out of my school. And so, and of course, businessmen loved this because less regulation by the government meant more freedom for them to do as they wish. So all of these groups come together and they're all really enthusiastic about President Reagan. Now, what did Reagan do? One of his biggest priorities was stopping communism anywhere it came up, fighting communism worldwide. We backed numerous anti-communist military governments around the world. We backed the Contras in Nicaragua, who were anti-communist rebels. We had a close relationship with the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. But we built up the American military. We developed a missile defense system that was designed to be able to shoot an intercontinental ballistic missile out of orbit. It was questionable how much it worked. And it was part of what was called the Star Wars program. This led to a myriad of jokes made at Reagan's expense, especially as it shared the name with a popular sci-fi movie that had come out in the 70s. However, Reagan actually started to lean into the humor a little bit. As one of his advisors said, well, hey, you know, the good guys won on that one. And so he started, this is the beginning of Reagan's jokes where he refers to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. So now, Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, at this point was trying to open the Soviet Union to dialogue with the West, the whole glasnost and perestroika business. And Reagan did meet with Gorbachev. So there was an open line of communication between the two, but ultimately it was Reagan kind of pushing Gorbachev. Okay, you say you want to open things up. You say you want to make the Soviet Union more free. Do it. Prove it to me. The Soviet Union did have another problem, though. The Soviet-Afghan War. See, the Soviet Union had supported a communist Afghan government. And this communist government in Afghanistan was opposed by fundamentalist Muslim rebels known as the Mujahideen. America, again, wanting to stop communism, is very interested in these Muslim rebels. And even more so because we wanted revenge for Vietnam. To us, the Soviet Union supplying the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese with weapons is one of the big reasons why they ultimately defeated us in Vietnam. We didn't want to do that. We were pretty annoyed that happened. And we wanted revenge. We wanted the Soviets to feel what it was like for us to go through that. We wanted to make them have a Vietnam experience. And so we said, hey, we too can play at this game. We'll arm the Mujahideen. We'll help train them how to lead an effective insurgency or guerrilla style warfare against a large, well-equipped army. Now, this was ultimately a success. The Mujahideen was successful in overthrowing the the Soviet-backed communist Afghan government and pushing the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. Although one interesting thing of note, one of the minor officers in the rebellion was a young, rich Saudi Arabian man by the name of Osama bin Laden. That name's going to become important in a little bit. Now, we're coming at an age where America just recently got out of our own war in Afghanistan against the Taliban, against fundamentalist Islamic terrorists, basically. And so it raises the question that a lot of you are probably asking, which is, what the heck were we thinking? Arming extremists. After all, in this era where we're seeing a lot of violent extremism, both from religious sources and other ideologies, it certainly raises this question: what the heck was the federal government thinking doing this? Well, it's really a story of different perspectives. See, from the American perspective, we're viewing the world in terms of the Truman Doctrine, right? To us, the whole world is a battlefield between two sides, communists and non-communists. And so religious extremists, remember, communism is atheistic. A central tenet of Marxist philosophy is that religion is just a lie. It is the drug of the people, the opiate of the people, Marx called it. So by very definition, religious extremists cannot be communist. If you're a diehard religious extremist, you can't be a communist. And so to us, setting up a theocracy, a government ruled by religion, was perfect because they'd be an ally forever, right? They would be an eternal ally because they can never turn to the Soviets because of religion versus atheism, which then means they're going to be on our side. They're going to be on our team forever. So to us, we were setting up a country in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, that was going to be our ally forever. Okay, so it's very clear America sees it that way. So then it raises the question, well, wait a minute. Us and the Mujahideen, we were fighting the same enemy. Communism was a threat to them. It was a threat to us. So why didn't this create the friendship, this bromance, this American-Afghan bromance that we thought it would? And the answer has to do with the Middle Eastern perspective. To them, the Soviets weren't some special evil empire. They were just one more foreign imperialist in the Muslim world. Right? To them, the Soviets weren't any worse than the British or others before them. And adding to this, the American alliance didn't seem to us. This was part of America leading the fight against godless communism. But to them, it's no different than in hundreds of other situations in the past where foreign nations would back a particular Middle Eastern country to spite a rival back at home, as we saw in World War I, where Britain backed numerous Arab forces in an effort to spite the Ottomans. So to them, there's nothing really different about this. America and the Soviets are just kind of foreign empires doing what foreign empires do in the Middle East. either invade or help the Middle Eastern people to spite the invading nation because you've got beef with them elsewhere. Now, getting out of geopolitics, what was it like to live in the 80s? Well, one of the big changes in the 1980s is the rise of personal computers. Now, computers had existed ever since Alan Turing had designed his, and there had been even earlier computers before that, analytical engines and things like that. Turing's the first very similar to modern computer, but really, for much of the 20th century, what computers existed were large, bulky instruments that took up an entire room. And they weren't designed for home use. It wasn't until the 1980s we get devices that are small enough and accessible enough to be used by the general population. And because of this, we start to see computers put into the home. Now, these aren't like your laptops or even desktops today. These are large, bulky desktops. And they often had limited memory. Many times files were stored on either cassette tapes, like literally they had like magnetic tape, floppy disks, or in the case of video game systems, cartridges. Now, speaking of computer technology also allowed for the rise of at-home video games. A leader in this industry was the company Atari. Atari single-handedly built much of the video game industry, or pretty much the video game industry of the 80s. And also single-handedly almost destroyed the entire industry. I'm going to give you a couple of commercials so you can get a vibe. The first is the Commodore 64. I'm going to move my screen over here so you can see a little better. Here's the Commodore 64 in action.
A day in the life of a Commodore 64.
Yeah, this is the computer.
The Commodore 64. Once you get it, you'll wonder how you got along without it.
Now, video game systems were also a major part of 80s culture. Now, unlike a lot of modern video games, they were almost exclusively marketed to children under the age of like 12. And I'm going to show you, and that's going to become very apparent when you see this commercial for the Atari 2600. So let's take a watch, take a listen in advance. I'm going to apologize for how corny this is. Oh.
The fun is back. Oh, yes, sirree. It's the 2600 from Atari. It's the video system with classics galore, from Space Invaders to cars that roar. A real hip joystick controls the screen. Solaris is hot and Midnight Magic's mean. And one more thing, it's got a special low price, under 50 bucks. 50 bucks? Now, isn't that nice? The fun is back. Oh, yes, sirree. It's the 2600 from Atari.
So yes, that's the Atari 2600. Now, what is 80s culture all about? Right? If you were growing up as a young person, as a teenager in the 80s, what would your life have been like? Well, the first thing we got to understand about 80s culture, one of the big things going on in 80s culture is the class divide. See, the Reagan economy was very good for certain people. For some folks, the 80s economy was perfection. And so if you were already rich, or you were in what we call the upper middle class, you were in the upper portion of the middle class, then you tended to get richer. For these people, this is when you went from owning one house to owning a house and a vacation home. Or your upper middle class, you went from having a 3-bedroom, 1-bath ranch with a single car in the, with a single Ford car in the driveway, to now you owned a, 5-bedroom, 2-bath colonial with a Mercedes and a Saab in the driveway. So it was a time you really moved up in the world. If you were poor, or you were in the lower portion of the middle class, the 80s was not such a good time for you. Often, if you were in a union, your union was losing negotiating power, or a lot of manufacturing jobs were starting to be shipped overseas. If you were in that group, you tended to get poorer. Now, another aspect of the 80s, fashion-wise, was fitness culture. Everyone was going to the gym. And even if you weren't going to the gym or working out, you kind of dressed like you did. This is the beginning of workout clothes that were kind of used as everyday clothes. People wore sweatsuits. Girls wore leg warmers. These became very popular. There was a sort of moral panic reaction to the more liberating society of the 60s and 70s, and there was a desire to shun that and return to traditional values. This was coupled with the rise of what is called televangelism, evangelical preachers who would go on TV and give their sermons over the television. Between this obsession with returning to traditional values and the rise of televangelism, we get a weird event known as the Satanic Panic. This was a fear that America was infested with satanic cults, and these cults were carrying out brutal sacrifices. There was a belief that children, that their minds were being corrupted by satanic, I can't do horns, satanic influences. Everything from heavy metal music to the role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons were accused of being secretly satanic. Now, another aspect of the 80s was the AIDS epidemic. Now, here's the thing. HIV cases first came to light in the 1980s due to mysterious deaths. See, as you know, the way the HIV virus kills you is very interesting. It doesn't specifically shut down your organs on its own. What it does is it weakens your immune system to the point where literally any other disease now becomes lethal. And this is when doctors really noticed something was wrong, is they started to have human patients that were dying of diseases that were typically found only in animals. These are diseases that normally an uncompromised human immune system would repel so quickly you wouldn't even know you were sick. All of a sudden, not only were there people who caught these diseases, but there were people who were dying of these diseases. And that was definitely something to be concerned about. So scientists began looking into, well, what exactly is this disease? And initially, the earlier cases they found in the United States were linked to the gay community in San Francisco. This caused the disease to gain the rather homophobic name of GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency. Now, this, of course, led to an increased prejudice against homosexual individuals, as they were now accused of carrying the AIDS virus. And it also led to prejudice against anyone who contracted the virus, as it was assumed that only gay people got the disease, or the disease could only be spread through having gay sexual relations. That's not the case. However, the disease did spread quickly among gay men in San Francisco due to a lack of sexual protection. Again, remember, sex ed was not a required class in most high schools. And so the public's knowledge about sexually transmitted infections is not what it is today. A lot of people back then, their assumption was that you used contraception to prevent pregnancy. So if you were practicing a form of relations that could not produce pregnancy, you assumed you didn't need it. Now, as your health teacher has probably told you, that's not really the prevailing wisdom. The wisdom is you needed to protect from disease. Now, eventually, scientists would get it right. They'd identify the real cause of the disease, what they called human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. The virus is closely related to SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus. And we now believe that the disease most likely originated from an individual eating contaminated bushmeat. Basically meaning a hunter at some point, most likely in the 40s or 50s, killed a monkey that was infected with simian immunodeficiency virus and improperly cooked the meat, allowing the virus to jump from animal to human. Very similar in many ways to the origin story of SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, where we had a version of the SARS virus that was in meat at a Chinese meat market, and that allowed it to jump from animal to human. So very, very similar origin story in the sense that you had contaminated meat, and that contaminated meat most likely being the cause of the virus. Now, the disease that resulted from prolonged exposure to the human infection with the human immunodeficiency virus was given the name AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Now, since the disease was most prevalent in the gay community, it was largely ignored by the Reagan government, leading to thousands of deaths. So what was music like in the 80s? A lot happens. So at this point, rock and roll has thoroughly split and new genres are now emerging. Heavy metal emerges out of the hard rock of the 70s. It has an emphasis even more on the electric guitar and the bass. Lyrics tended to be angrier and often referenced violence, criminality, or the occult. Think Iron Maiden, groups like that. Hip hop and rap also emerged. This is when they really become mainstream. While a lot of them have begun underground as kind of local phenomena in the late 70s, they go mainstream in the 80s. Hip hop and rap both focused on the spoken word over the use of instruments. And they tended to discuss the struggles of the African American community, often talking about poverty, oppression, and violence. Pop music also developed, although generally it was upbeat, and most of the messages tended to concern either people just having fun and partying or romantic stories. Punk rock also develops. Now, punk rock is unique. It is musically similar to metal in the sense that it focused mostly on the guitar and the bass, but it had a more activist bent to it. The songs tended to talk more about politics or oppression than just, violence or criminality. So in regards of their subject matter addressing social concerns, punk was more like rap. But in terms of how it sounded, if you listen to it, it sounded more like metal. It also did have some spoken word elements. Think Beastie Boys, No Sleep Till Brooklyn. Again, not all of them were deep. Some of them were, some of them weren't. There is, however, despite there being spoken word elements, there is no confirmed link that we have now between rap, which originated in the United States, and punk, which started in Great Britain. Now, one of the defining aspects of 1980s was the tough on crime movement. American politicians at all levels took on this stance that they were tough on crime. The rise of 24-hour news coverage made a lot more people aware of the criminality going on around them. And people started to get scared. They wanted politicians that promised they would do something. Politicians did. They said they were going to get tougher on crime. How they just, well, one way was through minimum sentencing, passing laws that said a judge was limited in how much leniency they could show to a convicted individual, often mandating that they serve at least a certain number of years. This was particularly hazardous to drug offenders. This is also when America really begins to build up its police forces. This led to a rise in incarceration, mass incarceration of African American and Latino individuals. The war on drugs, which had only continued, devastated communities of color as police attempted to rein in criminal elements selling more dangerous drugs, like crack cocaine, heroin, and crystal meth. And in the process of this struggle between the police and various drug dealing organizations, many ordinary people kind of got caught in the crossfire, with teenagers being arrested for small possessions of drugs and often getting lengthy sentences that destroyed their lives and careers. So let's talk about the 90s. Music in the 90s pretty much remained similar. The genres that we see begin in the 80s pretty much stick around, but they often mingled and crossed over with one another. Not these two on screen never did a crossover that I'm aware of, although that would be awesome. All right, 1990s culture. One, materialistic. Capitalism had won the Cold War, and so consumption was praised. Going to the mall and shopping, conspicuous spending, these were all seen as very, acceptable American activities. Clothing was casual. It often tended to be baggy. Kind of have the grunge look. Optimistic. Many ascribed to a unique idea known as the end of history. This was the belief that all history had been the struggle between oppressors and oppressed. And to them, they saw this final struggle being in the 20th century. First with the struggle against fascism in World War II, and then with the struggle between free market capitalism and command economy communism, with American democratic capitalism emerging as the triumphant victor. Many dreamed of an environmentally conscious, democratic, post-racial society that they believed would dawn in the new millennium. However, democracy wasn't coming easily. Well, America got itself involved in a new military operation, part of an international coalition known as Operation Desert Storm, originally Operation Desert Shield. This was a coalition to prevent Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein from invading the oil-rich nation of Kuwait. The war was a tactical success. It crushed Saddam's military utterly. This did have some interesting effects. It drove Saddam to rebrand his regime as a conservative Islamic state in an effort to hold on to power. So Saddam himself was not necessarily a fundamentalist Muslim, but he was concerned with holding on to power. So originally, he had kind of presented himself as a strongman type. I'm the tough guy. I'm the one who's going to expand your country. Then it failed. So he had to rebrand. So he branded himself as this, conservative Muslim leader trying to protect Iraq's traditional values from Western interference. Now, American Air Force had dominated the sky, but to do this, the US had used air bases, air landing strips in Saudi Arabia as launching points for American aircraft. Now, permission to use the airfields had been granted by the Saudi king. The Saudi government was perfectly fine with the US and other coalition forces using Saudi airspace and airstrips. And for this reason, most Saudi citizens and many moderate Muslims saw little issue. This was just secular politics. The US and the Saudis were allies. This had been a UN-ordered coalition. So there was no issue with Saudi Arabia allowing the United States to use their airspace. But because that airspace was close to Mecca, that airstrip was close to Mecca, many more radical or more fundamentalist Muslims took offense to these infidels, to these non-Muslims being so close to the holiest spot in Islam. And this would become an issue later. Now, we got to talk about the LA riot. So, the story of the LA riot begins with the beating of Rodney King. Now, Rodney King was arrested for speeding and attempts to evade the police. When officers took him out of his car, they beat him multiple times with nightsticks, the clubs they carry, while uttering racist comments about gorillas in the mist. And there's a video, but YouTube will not allow me to show it to you. But I do invite you to check it out. I'll include a link to it so you can see this with the assignment in Google Classroom. So the next event we got to talk about is the killing. So in between all of this, another event had happened. This event was in March 16th of 1991. 16-year-old Latasha Harlins was shot by a woman named Sunja Du. I believe I'm pronouncing both people's names correctly. I could be wrong. If I'm not, please let me know. Sunja Du managed a business alongside her husband. They managed a small grocery store, convenience store type of thing. Miss Du was Korean American. Miss Harlins was African American. Now, Latasha was shot by Sunja Du after Miss Du mistakenly believed that Latasha had been attempting to steal a bottle of orange juice. There was a physical struggle, and young Latasha Harlins was shot in the back of the head while she attempted to flee. So at court, Sunja Du, she was convicted with voluntary manslaughter, which basically means manslaughter is often similar to or kind of synonymous with third-degree murder. What it means is you killed somebody, but you didn't set out to murder somebody. But it's voluntary in the sense that you did ultimately make the decision. Involuntary manslaughter means like when there's an accident or negligence, you killed somebody, but you didn't do anything where you meant to kill anybody. Voluntary manslaughter is you did something, maybe you intended to cause harm, but you did kill somebody. Now, the jury recommended the maximum sentence, 16 years in prison. The judge, Joyce Carlin, she rejected this. She didn't feel that Miss Du was a threat. And so she gave her probation, 400 hours of community service, and a $500 fine. This was absolutely beyond ridiculous. That is an incredibly low sentence for manslaughter. To give you a perspective, I've seen people get a fine and community service for having an open alcohol container in public, not for killing a teenager. But I'm not a judge. It became a sign of the devaluation of African American life. There's a line in, I think it became referenced in a lot of popular songs. In Tupac's song, I Wonder If Heaven Has a Ghetto, he makes a reference to the killing of Miss Harlins. I'm not going to play it for you, but it's here if you ever want to see it. All right. So now we finally got on to, now, Sunja Du, that trial happened before Rodney King's trial. So now we arrive at his trial. Now, the men who beat him were to stand trial for police brutality. Now, because of the negative public reaction to Miss Harlan's murder trial, public officials had moved the trial to a nearby suburb. Now, the suburb was majority white, and a lot of the residents were family and friends of the police department. Most of it. LA has a sizable black community. This will become important. Now, despite the presence of video footage of the officers beating the limp Rodney King, the jury acquitted the officer on all charges. So even though they saw them beating him, they said, no, they didn't do anything wrong. The public was furious. And young people took to the streets, smashing police cars and looting stores. Any public buildings that were connected to the court system were attacked. A particular animosity was directed at anyone who was Caucasian, anyone who was white, anyone who was Asian American, as well as law enforcement personnel. The riot lasted for days on end until finally the National Guard was called in to break up the riot. So we're going to move on. This was the video of the riot. I'll post it another time. Here is President Bush's address on the subject. I'm going to play it for you and get his take on this because he was the president. This is George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush.
Tonight, I want to talk to you about violence in our cities and justice for our citizens. Two big issues that have collided on the streets of Los Angeles. First, an update on where matters stand in Los Angeles. 15 minutes ago, I talked to California's Governor Pete Wilson and Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley. They told me that last night was better than the night before. Today, calmer than yesterday. But there were still incidents of random terror and lawlessness this afternoon. In the wake of the first night's violence, I spoke directly to both Governor Wilson and Mayor Bradley to assess the situation and to offer assistance. There are two very different issues at hand. One is the urgent need to restore order. What followed Wednesday's jury verdict in the Rodney King case was a tragic series of events for the city of Los Angeles. Nearly 4,000 fires, staggering property damage, hundreds of injuries, and the senseless deaths of over 30 people. To restore order right now, there are 3,000 National Guardsmen on duty in the city of Los Angeles. Another 2,200 stand ready to provide immediate support. To supplement this effort, I've taken several additional actions. First, this morning, I have ordered the Justice Department to dispatch 1,000 federal riot-trained law enforcement officials to help restore order in Los Angeles, beginning tonight. These officials include FBI SWAT teams, special riot control units of the U.S. Marshals Service, the Border Patrol, and other federal law enforcement agencies. Second, another 1,000 federal law enforcement officials are on standby alert should they be needed. Third, early today, I directed 3,000 members of the 7th Infantry and 1,500 Marines to stand by at El Toro Air Station, California. Tonight, at the request of the governor and the mayor, I have committed these troops to help restore order. I am also federalizing the National Guard, and I'm instructing General Colin Powell to place all those troops under a central command. What we saw last night and the night before in Los Angeles is not about civil rights. It's not about the great cause of equality that all Americans must uphold. It's not a message of protest. It's been the brutality of a mob, pure and simple. And let me assure you, I will use whatever force is necessary to restore order. What is going on in LA must and will stop. As your president, I guarantee you this violence will end. And now let's talk about the beating of Rodney King, because beyond the urgent need to restore order is the second issue, the question of justice whether Rodney King's federal civil rights were violated. What you saw and what I saw on the TV video was revolting. I felt anger. I felt pain. I thought, how can I explain this to my grandchildren? Civil rights leaders and just plain citizens fearful of and sometimes victimized by police brutality were deeply hurt. And I know good and decent policemen who were equally appalled. I spoke this morning to many leaders of the civil rights community. They saw the video, as we all did. For 14 months, they waited patiently, hopefully. They waited for the system to work. And when the verdict came in, they felt betrayed. Viewed from outside the trial, it was hard to understand how the verdict could possibly square with the video. Those civil rights leaders with whom I met were stunned. And so was I, and so was Barbara, and so were my kids. But the verdict Wednesday was not the end of the process. The Department of Justice had started its own investigation immediately after the Rodney King incident and was monitoring the state investigation and trial. And so let me tell you what actions we are taking on the federal level to ensure that justice is served. Within 1 hour of the verdict, I directed the Justice Department to move into high gear on its own independent criminal investigation into the case. And next, on Thursday, 5 federal prosecutors were on their way to Los Angeles. Our Justice Department has consistently demonstrated its ability to investigate fully a matter like this. Since 1988,
We'll stop there. Now, let's talk about the Clinton presidency. Now, George H.W. Bush lost his reelection bid to Bill Clinton. President Clinton was a mild Democrat. He was keen on making reforms of the free market, but he didn't build up a lot of government programs. He also continued the tough on crime policies of his Republican predecessors. During this time, 2 genocides happened in the outside world. The genocide in the African nation of Rwanda in 1994, which saw no U.S. intervention, and the Bosnian genocide in, well, what's now Bosnia, in the former Yugoslavia, Europe, which did see U.S. airstrikes. Now, one of the defining moments of the Clinton presidency was his impeachment. Now, President Clinton was impeached for the crime of perjury, the crime of lying while under oath. In court, he had been questioned about an extramarital affair he had had with a young secretary, Monica Lewinsky. And the president denied it. When forensics proved that he did, in fact, have this affair, he was convicted. He was judged to have committed perjury. Clinton claimed it wasn't perjury based on the question asked of him. Jury didn't buy the definitional argument. The Senate articles of impeachment were filed against him. There was a trial in the Senate. The Senate declined to convict. Now, another major event of the 90s was the rise in terrorism. In Waco, we saw a standoff between federal officials and an armed cult. This led to the death of numerous cultists at the hands of police.
The flames may be out, but a firestorm of controversy rages on after the assault on the Branch Davidian compound. Officials are starting to look for answers after doomsday in Waco. This morning, investigators began sifting through the embers of the Waco compound, searching for the bodies of more than 80 cult members believed killed in the fire. In Washington, President Clinton says he gives his full support to the decisions made by the Attorney General and the FBI to end the siege. But the family members of those killed in Waco have bitter words for those they say must bear the responsibility for needless death. Under the blistering Texas sun, investigators comb the smoldering remains of the Branch Davidian compound. More than 80 people are believed to have died in yesterday's fiery conclusion to the 51-day siege, 24 of them children. Today, the FBI said it's not responsible.
Now, In retaliation for Waco, 2 former U.S. soldiers launched a bombing in Oklahoma City in 1995. Their names were Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. Both planted bombs in a federal government building. The newscast on that is over here.
If it seemed like war yesterday, the reinforcements showed up tonight. At the center of it all, of course, is the bombed-out shell of the federal office building, and in its shadow, the exhausted, who for a day and a half now have sifted through its debris and counted its dead and seen up close why they call it terror.
It's like a garbage pile. It's just, it's unbelievable. Everywhere you dig, you find somebody. Everywhere.
Very slow, tedious process of removing the debris and extricating the fatalities and searching for survivors. You know, you hope and you pray that every time you turn a stone, there'll be a survivor somewhere. It hurts deep down as to why someone would do something of this magnitude. It's unreal.
It hurts down deep for everyone here. The curious now have come to see it for themselves, and still those who hold out hope come too, even though there is so little hope left.
If anybody knows of anything, this is my mom. She's 47. She's about 5'2" and weighs about 150 pounds. And I'm 22 years old. I'm too young to lose my mother.
Every rock I grab and throw, I'm thinking that our hands would reach up through that little hole and say, I'm here, but that hasn't happened so far.
Are there people missing from your office? Yeah, 26. You don't know what's happened. I can look at that building and imagine what's happened to them.
Dr. Rick Nelson spent most of yesterday in the rubble, helping to locate survivors.
I found myself this morning looking back at things and thinking of things that I didn't really think about during the thing, and tears still come to my eyes, for the families.
Few here talk or even think about the investigation. The governor, though, doesn't have that luxury and does think about men who are capable of this.
Well, they're evil, they're cowardly, they're unspeakably shameless.
Rescue workers kept their vigil.
Now, the final event of the 90s terrorism rise is the Columbine Massacre, carried out by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. They were high school loners with Nazistic leanings and a penchant for destruction. When describing their planned massacre of their classmates, they said, quote, "It'll be like World War I, the LA riots, and doom all combined." They began the shooting in the high school cafeteria. They famously asked, "Will all the jocks please stand up?" And when they did, the young men opened fire. One of the reasons for the increased casualties at Columbine is inadequate police strategy. At the time, the wisdom among law enforcement was to treat this like a hostage situation, which is to surround the building and then wait to bring in hostage negotiators and SWAT teams and stuff like that. And this gave the murderers additional time to kill more people. This has led to a change in protocol, where officers are now advised to go into the building almost immediately and begin trying to seek out and, shall we say, neutralize the perpetrator. This is the broadcast from 1999 on the subject.
The investigation into the high school massacre is slow-moving and dangerous. The 2 gunmen who went on the rampage booby-trapped the building and even themselves. All day long, investigators have searched the homes of both teenage killers. In one of them, police say they found bomb-making materials. Specially trained officers searching the school today found close to 30 explosive devices all around the building. Authorities have also revised the death toll, now saying 15 people were killed, including the 2 gunmen. Most of the bodies are still inside the school, but families of the murder victims have been notified. NJ Burkett begins our coverage. He is live in Littleton, Colorado. NJ.
And Roz, we're being kept far away. The building off in the distance is still sealed off. As you said, the bodies have not yet been removed. A total of 15 people are believed to have died here, 12 students, 1 faculty member, and the 2 young killers. Investigators say this attack appears to have been carefully planned for a long time.
One by one, students returned to Columbine High and left bouquets of flowers in a park half a mile away.
A little bit of pain, a little bit of everything at once. It's deep, you know, but just got to be strong.
Parents, hug your kids. Pray that, be happy that you're with them. Kids, grab your friends, hold them tight, and never be mad at people because it could happen in a second that they'll be gone.
Investigators found their first pipe bomb in the parking lot, and the Denver bombs.
Now, culture war. Christian evangelical fundamentalists began to strengthen their hold on the Republican Party, pushing major Republican talking points, including opposition to abortion, gay marriage, and some elements of being opposed to multiculturalism. Democrats in the 90s became less radical. There was an aversion to having anything to do with socialism. Very similar to what we see in the Labour Party in Britain. And attempts to build a more accepting world, but only by peaceful means. Environmental activism was a major point. Now, this cultural schism really comes to life when we talk about Roe v. Wade. Now, this decision had come all the way back in 1973, legalizing abortion in all 50 states. But this happened largely because Texas lost the case after Texas Attorney General Everett Wade attempted to use the Declaration of Independence's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness as a basis for legal rights. The Supreme Court, once basically thoroughly educating counsel on the fact that the Declaration is not a legally binding document, proceeded to rule that abortion was legal based upon the 9th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. This is often hailed as a triumph for second-wave feminism, for the women's liberation movement, but maligned by religious leaders who see this as the destruction of thousands of innocent lives. Some people had responded from the 70s through the 90s with bombing attacks on abortion clinics, while others launched costly legal battles in an attempt to overturn or limit abortion. One of the final fears of the 90s was what's called Y2K. This was a fear that computer programming would not be able to process the change of millennium from 1999 to 2000. The fear was that thousands of computers would crash on January 1st, 2001. People had apocalyptic fears that it would lead to the erasure of banking records and nuclear reactors would melt down. The reality is that this had been patched in most computers long before. And in the computers where it wasn't patched, mostly old library computers that were not connected to the internet, all that happened was that it just reset to the year 1000, and a few people got phony overdue library bills saying that they'd borrowed the book for 1,000 years. That's it. That brings us to an end to the 90s. In our next installment, we'll talk about the world of the 21st century.